Keane. So this is the third lecture that has been delivered by Professor John Keane. So it seems that we have a full house again, one of Professor Keane's lectures. And today the topic will be Michel Foucault. So I will say a few words about Professor John Keane for those of you who did not come to the first two lectures. I think that most of you know Professor Keane quite well by now, but I'm just going to say a few words again, okay? So Dr. John Keane is a professor of politics at the University of Sydney and at the Wissenschaft Zentrum Berlin. He is co-founder and director of the Sydney Democracy Network. He is globally renowned for his creative thinking about democracy. Among his many books are The Media and Democracy, which has been translated into 25 languages, Democracy in the Civil Society, Reflections on Violence, Civil Society, Old Images, New Visions, and the prize-winning biography, Tom Paine, A Political Life. And his more recent works include Democracy and Media, Decadence, The Future of Representative Democracy, Violence in Democracy, Global Civil Society, and most recently, Life and Death of Democracy, of course. So I think we all know the provenance of Michel Foucault's ideas, his penetrating analysis of our social and individual existence. John today will take us, and for many of us, once again, into the intellectual world created by Foucault's majestic overall history of sexuality. So as usual, Professor John Keane will speak for 50 minutes or 1 hour, and afterwards we open the floor to questions and discussions. Okay, please.
Thank you very much. I want to say 大家下午好 and 谢谢来参加. Thank you very much for coming along. Friends and colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, for those of you who have been to the first two lectures on the topic of 政治, politics, and Western conceptions of politics, and those of you who were not at these lectures for very good reasons, I'm sure, I want to say just very briefly something about the territory that we have so far covered. The aim of these lectures is to introduce you and to get you thinking about different conceptions of the political that come from another patch of the earth, to encourage you, as I mentioned in the opening lecture, to do what anthropologists sometimes do. This is Claude Lévi-Strauss's idea of expatriation. That is, to, as it were, leave your own setting, your own context, and travel to another context where conceptions of politics may be actually strange, different, but maybe also intelligible to you because there is some resonance with your local understandings of politics. So far, I've talked about two radically different understandings of 政治. In the first lecture, Carl Schmitt, and if I had to summarize, it is that for Carl Schmitt, politics is a process of struggle for power that involves defining enemies and winning friends to seize sovereign state power. That is politics. And that means politics for Schmitt is about confrontation, conflict. It is about instrumentalizing others. It is about defining borders. It is about police and armies. And it is about the protection of sovereignty. And in a crisis, when there is a threat to political order, politics flourishes because politics is the art in that context of deciding who will govern through the state. It's a neo-Hobbesian understanding of politics. We then looked last week at the quite different understanding of Hannah Arendt. I think certainly the greatest woman political thinker of the 20th century, someone profoundly, personally and politically upset and damaged by the experience of totalitarianism, who tried to revive, you'll remember from last week, classical Greek and Roman understandings of politics, where politics means not violence, not friends and enemies, not state power, not borders, not sovereignty, not war, but politics is the non-violent coming together of people in public. A kind of gong gong, where a public comes together to decide in a small setting or a large setting, decide how they are to handle their power, to decide who should get how much and when and how, where politics comes to mean the struggle for collectively deciding the good life. And ideally, as we discussed last week, Hannah Arendt had in mind the workers' council, the neighborhood meeting, the process during an election when millions of people are talking about how they should be governed, and revolutions, which, as Arendt points out, typically have a moment where many people, often millions of people, gather, join together and feel their power, and they change the world. A government collapses or is removed. We talked about that last time. Tonight, I want to, if you are already confused and not sure what you think about these two views, I want to add more confusion or more enrichment by introducing you, if you have read nothing of Michel Foucault, to his writings about politics, where we're about to find out that Foucault has a critique of Carl Schmitt, and he also has a critique of Hannah Arendt. And his understanding of politics, la politique, is different again. An understanding of politics that has had a very big resonance in the West during the last several decades. I will try to explain that. It's summarized, just to give you a hint, with the slogan of the women's movement that was reborn in the United States and Europe and elsewhere at the end of the 1960s, where the slogan that was used widely was, "The personal is political." The personal is political. What I want to show to you is that Michel Foucault is the theorist of that political slogan, and a theorist who is immensely sophisticated. Now, for those of you who know nothing about Foucault, born in 1926 in Poitiers, died relatively young of AIDS in 1984. He was, for many years, at the Collège de France. It's the most prestigious institution in France, where he was professor of the history of systems of thought. He is the author of many famous and best-selling books, Madness and Civilization, The Archaeology of Knowledge, Discipline and Punish. It's a book about the modernization of the prison system in Europe. The Birth of the Clinic. It's on the origins of modern medicine. And The Order of Things, a great book on the origins of the modern human sciences. You will also know, if you read about him, that he was a political animal. We'll find out in what sense a political animal, but he was active, especially from the 1960s onwards, in lending his voice to and helping to organize a politics in defense of marginalized peoples. He himself was gay, and you will see that there is the history of sexuality is in some sense autobiographical. He was also very active in defending prisoners' rights and formed a group called GIR, the Groupe d'Information sur les Prisons, which was a defense group to extend rights to prisoners. He taught for quite a number of years in Berkeley, and when asked what his politics were, you know, what are your political persuasions? Are you a leftist or a rightist? He famously said, I have nothing to say about that. I suggest you check the police files on me, and you will find out more about me than I could ever tell you about myself. This, briefly, friends, is a few words about Michel Foucault. I want to say something about the methods that he used just to make sense of this book, this great book, The History of Sexuality. What you will find running through Foucault's work, first of all, is the insistence that we should not think of agency, we should not think of subjectivity as rooted in individuals who are, so to say, the center of the universe. Foucault is a strong critic of what he grew up with, thanks to Jean-Paul Sartre and others, existentialism. Throughout his work, you will see that he pictures the bodily individual, each one of us, as embedded in a language, in structures. That there is a kind of structuration that he tries to analyze. That is to say, his starting point is that we should not think in individualistic terms about societies. We should not make a fetish, we should not worship the free subject. We should see that subjectivity, the capacity to act in the world, is always itself pre-structured. And this was the influence, so to say, of structuralism, French structuralism, of anthropologists like Lévi-Strauss, Althusser in the field of Marxism. It indicates the effect of structuralism, the impact of structuralism on his own way of thinking. He once was, and several times in fact, denounced Jean-Paul Sartre as someone who believed in what Foucault called transcendental narcissism, you know, that Sartre makes a fetish of the individual, of the potentially free individual. This existentialist way of thinking Foucault never liked. And he also was strongly critical of Foucault's, of Jean-Paul Sartre's belief that he could be a kind of master thinker, a master philosopher, who could be a kind of Bolshevik in thinking. This is not Foucault's style. Foucault's style is actually to deconstruct knowledge and power, and actually to develop differentiated, a much more complicated, more flatter, so to say, approach. The second, the second theme that runs through Foucault's work is that, as with Hannah Arendt, language is very important. Language has a kind of dynamic of its own. Foucault typically called it discourse, by which he means a set of symbols in which subjects live and through which they live, and those symbols are structured by rules. So he learned, for example, much from linguists like Saussure, the Swiss linguist, who reminded us that when we speak, we are speaking actively, we are practicing our subjectivity, but the rules that pre-structure what we say are very important, and they need to be analyzed as such. And this is very much, as you'll see in a moment, the way that Foucault spoke about discourses. Discourses on the prison, discourses on madness, and discourses on sexuality. A third theme that runs through Foucault's work is that he's a deeply historical thinker. He has a great sensitivity to the relationship between the past and the present. And what is important to understand, I can't describe it in any detail, is that during his early works, he describes his work as a kind of archaeology. What is archaeology? Archaeology is the going back to the past to probe, to dig deeply, to find the structures of the past, to find the structures, the institutional linguistic structures that shaped human beings in that context. Archaeology is the intellectual exercise of recovering, of remembering those past rules of people who are no longer living. Later on, Foucault came to see that one weakness of the archaeological method, which is at work in the history of sexuality, you'll see, one weakness is that it can't account for transformation, for ruptures that happen, for transformations from one discourse, one dominant discourse to another. And so he became interested in genealogy. This is Nietzsche's term, in which, as a genealogist, what he tries to do is to examine the structures, the languages of power and knowledge that shaped people's lives at some point in the past, and to show the relevance of all of this for the present. This, very briefly, is the guiding themes, the methodological techniques, so to say, that Foucault uses in this book, The History of Sexuality. I don't know if this book is translated into Chinese. The first volume, I expect it is. Yes? Yes, good. I'm not sure of the quality of translation. It's very well written. It's sometimes repetitive, and it contains a family of new terms that we need to talk about. Let me try to summarize, by way of an interpretation, a summary that will simplify this book to help you make sense of it. The book opens with an attack on what he calls the repressive hypothesis. What does this mean? Once upon a time, he says, there were people who thought, and today think, that in the past, our grandparents and our great-grandparents and our great-great-grandparents were ashamed of sexuality. They didn't like to talk about the body. Women covered their bodies with long dresses. Sex was not a subject discussed at the meal table. If a young woman became pregnant, it would not be talked about. Anybody who was sexually deviant was hidden away. In short, according to this orthodox interpretation, which Foucault attacks, there was a period during the reign of Queen Victoria, from the end of the 18th century through the 19th century, a period, it was said, where sex was repressed, as if the body and desires of people's bodies were weighed down by power, repressed. According to Foucault, this, empirically speaking, is wrong. It simply doesn't make sense when you consider that, in fact, from the end of the 18th century in particular, he's speaking about Europe, of course, through the course of the 19th century and until today, writing this book, publishing it in 1976, modern Western societies have been obsessed with sex. There was a great outpouring, according to him, an institutional incitement to speak about sex, to define it, to categorize it, to institutionalize it. Sex, as he puts it, was to be taken charge of and tracked down. Something like a new political economy of sex is born of the 18th century, and he has very interesting things to say about the birth of political economy as a discipline. You know, born of the late 18th century, for example, in the Scottish cities of Glasgow and Edinburgh. What he wants to say is that political economy and other new disciplines like psychology and psychiatry and demography, history, began to pay attention to the human body and to its functions. He points out that sex was analyzed, there was stock taking, classification, specification, quantification, causal studies of such things as birth rates, the age of marriage, the frequency of sex, whether the fertility rate is rising or falling, the degree of marriage, the use of contraception, population increases and declines, and so on. So his thesis is that a whole range of professions and power knowledge dynamics developed from the end of the 18th century to pay attention to the body, to be preoccupied with the body, to define sexuality. And this tendency he calls the birth of a normalizing society. And what he wants to say here is that there is, of course, a norm that is built into so much of this inquiry. The norm is the bourgeois norm of a middle-class family with private bedrooms, with several children, with a division between male and female, where marriage is heterosexual, and where this becomes the model for example, the proletariat, the working classes to follow. He doesn't go into the class basis of this normalizing society very much. There are just a few hints in the history of sexuality. Other historians have done this. But what he wants to say is that the net effect of this historical shift, which is still with us today, is that disciplines like demography and biology and medicine and psychiatry and psychology and ethics and pedagogy, even architecture, can be read as preoccupied with the body and seek to define what is or what ought to be appropriate sexuality. He points out that these discourses on sexuality contain silences. For instance, certain things are not analyzed. Rape is an embarrassment, according to him, of the normalizing society. Or adultery, you know, the practice of men wandering off, although married, and having sexual relations with other women. This is something that is not widely discussed, and it is, so to say, put under the table. He wants to say that this development, this preoccupation with sexuality runs very deep into the society. And here there is the case that he liked, Michel Foucault often liked to draw out a case from the archives, a particular person, to tell a story that gives you a very good sense of the whole thesis. And the case that in this book he describes in a few pages is the case of Monsieur V. Who was Monsieur V? An unknown peasant, a farm worker who had no family, who liked to come in and out of the local village, who slept in horse stables and barns with animals, who liked to do what most villagers did, which was to steal a kiss from the local girls. And one day, the parents of a local girl, a young girl, reported Monsieur V to the mayor. The mayor called the police, the constable, and the constable arrested Monsieur V. Monsieur V was then sent before the courts, where a judge convicted him to imprisonment for the rest of his life in a hospital. And during the arrest and the trial and his conviction, Monsieur V became the object of several reports which were published as a book. Notice, knowledge is being accumulated of this strange character who is a misfit, whose sexuality seems unclear, and whose crime, according to that period, whose crime is to have kissed, to exchange kisses with a young girl. And Foucault points out that in the process of his imprisonment, his incarceration, there were measurements taken of his brain. There were drawings done of his facial structure, because it was thought that he might be of interest to science. This, Foucault says, is typical of what happens in the modern European westernization project. You can think of Foucault as rather like a Max Weber. You know, Max Weber was concerned with the bureaucratization of the world, the way that capitalism institutes strict rules about profit-taking and assets and risk-taking and so on. The same kind of process, according to Foucault, happens in the sphere of intimate life, in personal life, in the field of sexuality. What is interesting in this book is that Foucault says, he introduces the word truth, and he means by this something like Zhenli. Zhenli? Yes, Zhenli. Something like a hard understanding of truth. Truth comes to be associated with sexuality. Why? Because, for instance, the psychologist who investigates the sexuality of a young boy or a woman, an adult woman, is engaged in a process of knowledge creation. And the word truth is used by them to describe actually the investigation, the type of investigation that they're conducting. What Foucault says is that one of the paradoxes of this whole growth of a normalizing society is that heterogeneity spreads. In other words, do not think of the history of sexuality in the West as a history of homogenization. There is certainly a bourgeois model of sexuality. But striking, says Foucault, is the way that a whole new taxonomy of sexuality is invented. So, for example, the category of the homosexual. It's a 19th century invention. The lesbian, it's a much later invention as a category. Zoophilia. There are people who get sexual pleasure being with animals. This is a new category invented. There is the woman who suffers the vapors. I think this is impossible to translate into Chinese, but it was thought during the 19th century that some women feel faint and, collapse. And this is called having the vapors. And it's thought that this is something to do with a sexual imbalance in this woman, and that she needs treatment, confinement, for instance. There is the child who masturbates. And today we would say that this process of naming specific categories of sexual identity continues. So we now have in English the word queer, or we have LGBTI, relatively recent invention. Or we now know from this Toronto violence, incels. So there's a category of online people who describe themselves as involuntary celibates. They never have sex. And this is a new category, INCEL. This, Foucault says, is typical of modern understandings of sexuality. So the strange thing is, in short, that modern Western civilization, rather than repressing sexuality, is fascinated and obsessed with sexuality and seeks to define it, to normalize it, to categorize it, to pay attention to it, to discover the truth of sexuality. I want now to say, this is a paragraph that summarizes this last point. I want now to say something about Chuanli, power. Foucault, in a very striking sentence in this book, says that in political thought and analysis we have still not cut off the head of the king. My students love this sentence. When I first read it, I also found it unforgettable. What exactly does Foucault mean? That in political thought and analysis we have still not cut off the head of the king. What he wants to say is that when we think about power and politics, we typically think of the king, of the sovereign, of the queen, of a state, of powerful people up there. Carl Schmitt. Foucault says that this understanding of power has to do with sovereignty, with violence, with the sword, with taking away life if necessary, where power is the ability to force someone to do something that they don't want to do, and if they resist, using violence to ensure that they do what they are told. Foucault says this way of thinking about power makes no sense when you look at the history of sexuality. Because what he wants to say is that this history of sexuality, this modernization of sexuality, requires a different understanding of Chuanli. And I want to say now, just for 5 minutes or so, a few things about his new, unusual, and I would say very influential understanding of power. According to Foucault, all human life, in every sphere of life, from the bedroom to the battlefield, is infused with relations of power. There is no escaping power. Power is a relationship among people and things. It's a relationship that can be vertical, it can be more horizontal. But power, understood as a relationship of structuring people's lives and enabling or blocking people from acting, is part of the human condition. There is no outside of power. In this sense, the quotations, there are many in this book, are useful. Power is everywhere, writes Foucault, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. Whenever we speak, whenever we interact, whenever we make love, whenever we vote, whenever we go to work, whenever, etc., in every one of these relations, power is at work. And this means, according to Foucault, that when it comes to the body and sexuality, there is no outside of power. The body of each of us and the sexuality that we display, the pleasures that we get from sex, the kissing, the holding hands, the flirtation, etc., I shouldn't describe it in such detail, that all of this is embodied in power. Power is already there in all of these activities in our relations with other. Power is, in this sense, relational. It is omnipresent. It is found everywhere. And power, in this sense, shapes. Going back to his understanding of the subject, power shapes identities and it shapes bodies. Notice that for Carl Schmitt, power does affect bodies in the act of taking the life of someone, in war or in a coup d'etat. It's when you end life. The body of someone, the breathing, living body, is extinguished. For Hannah Arendt, when people gather together in public, they do so with their bodies, but it's interesting that she doesn't say very much about bodies. She speaks more about bodies when it comes to labor and work. For Foucault, the body, the human body that we each have, is itself central to the understanding of politics. It's central to the understanding of power. Of course, he says that in the course of this book, that power relationships like to hide themselves away. They like to camouflage themselves. They like to legitimate themselves. Power thrives on camouflage. Power thrives on silence. And power thrives on secrecy. This is true. But nevertheless, power is everywhere. There is no inside and outside of power. And what Foucault wants to say here, to repeat, is that zhuchuan, sovereignty, is not a helpful category in the analysis of politics, because sovereignty is understood as up there, that power, we have a habit of still speaking, certainly in European languages, you know, the powerful, or I have no power, they have all the power, Trump has all the power. Foucault says this is a mistaken way of thinking about power, because power relations exist in every institution, in even the most private domains. And not only that, here's an important point. He wants to say that reversals of power that happen in everyday life can have very big effects. His whole vision, his whole picture of modernity, of Western modernity, is that modern capitalist state societies have invented a whole series of power strategies that enable both capitalism and state institutions to survive and to thrive. These relationships of power are basic for the formation of people's sense of themselves, and they also, unless challenged, they have stabilizing effects on the whole political order. It's rather a version of Hannah Arendt's understanding of power, but instead of, remember, Arendt's understanding of power is that power develops when people join in public with one another. And then people power happens. Foucault says that actually this is too restricted, that power that envelops, surrounds a body can also be resisted, it can be changed. Where there is power, there is resistance, is a very short sentence in this book. When he comes to speaking about power and sexuality, one implication, of course, is that sex is not natural. You know, my grandmother would have said, well, boys are boys and girls are girls. And that's just the way the world is. You know, that way of thinking about sexuality, says Foucault, is deeply mistaken. There is no natural foundation of sexuality. And this is an idea that theorists like Judith Butler, the famous American feminist, have developed. You know, that power relations structure who we are and what our sense of sexuality is. How we describe ourselves is an effect of power. And there's nothing natural about that. There is nothing God-given about those identities and those relations of power. They can be changed. And this, as we'll see in just a moment, leads us to this whole Foucauldian idea that the personal is political. I want to say just a few words about governmentality. I don't know if this is 治理. I mean, this is governance. 治理术.
在学术翻译中 ，governmentality 是治理术。
Je l'ai chaud. Je l'ai chaud. Okay. So this is a term that later Foucault invented. It's caused quite a lot of confusion. But what he wants to say is that the exercise of administration, the administrative regulation of the body in such fields as psychiatry and psychology and demography and so on, are all examples of governmentality. In English and in French, this has a sort of double meaning. You know, governmentality means people think in terms of government. Not government in the sense of the government of Canada, but in the sense of governing the bodies and identities of individual bodies. And Foucault wants to say that modernity is, in this sense, involves a great flourishing of governmentality. And his criticism of political thought, of European political thought, is that it's paid almost no attention to the prison, to the birth of the clinic, medicine. It's paid no attention to the mental asylum. And it has not written about the history of sexuality. And it's time, says Foucault in his life's work, it's time that we actually paid attention to these forms of regulation, this governmentality, because they are so basic in the shaping of ourselves from the day we are born. This, I think, is enough on his idea of power, and I want to say something finally about the politics of sexuality. We come here to a third understanding of politics. When I was young, and when Foucault wrote this book, there was a widespread belief that you didn't have to be a leftist, but there was a widespread belief that we were living in a repressive society, and the way to roll back the repressive society represented by our parents was to have sex and have as much as we could get, to be blunt. This was a view of sexuality that you find in the writings of Herbert Marcuse, the great thinker of the Frankfurt School who emigrated to the United States and lived in and taught in San Diego for many years. Herbert Marcuse called for a great refusal. This means stand up to your parents, leave home, don't get married, and enjoy yourselves. Have as much pleasure as you can. Now, I'm sure China is not like this today. But what Foucault is doing in this book is attacking that view. Because he says that the problem with that view is that it supposes that sex is a weapon against power. You know, the dominating power of government, the dominating power of business, the dominating power of consumption, the dominating power of our parents. It's basically a mistake because it forgets that power is everywhere, and when even different forms of sexuality are practiced, power is already operating. He doesn't like this image of sexual liberation, and this raises the question, the normative question, of what kind of sexuality he, Michel Foucault, is proposing. You can see from this analysis so far that he's not especially happy with the governmentality that has become the norm. And yet it wasn't clear in this book what the counterfactual is, that is, what alternative vision or visions of a sexual good life would be. What he does do, which is very interesting, is that in one section of this book, he distinguishes between East and West. He says that the West, mainly the Atlantic region, is a society, a type of society, historically bound, that privileges the normalizing techniques, the governmentality of the body, the the regulation and administration and categorization of the body and its pleasures. And he contrasts this with erotic, what he calls erotic societies. I think it's not very convincing, but in a couple of pages he refers to China, Japan, India, Rome, and the Arab Muslim societies. You know that he went to Iran at the time of the revolution there. And what he wants to say is that in these societies traditionally, sex was regarded in a different way. There was very little administration of sex. There were no specialized professions. The body, each person knew, could give pleasure, interacting with oneself or with another. And the eroticism that comes from that pleasure, the joy, the pleasure, is not something that is subject to science. And this raises the question of whether Foucault actually was thinking in support of the East against the West. That is a question that many readers of this book ask themselves. It doesn't answer that question. Only later, in the publication of several books, the very last books that he wrote, does Michel Foucault give an answer to this question of what is to be done, of what kind of politics of sexuality he prefers. And the way he does it is to go back to the classical world, to ancient Greece and to Rome, just like Hannah Arendt. But instead of finding words and deeds, instead of finding politics in her sense, he finds bodily pleasures that are regulated, self-regulated in a very different way. What he notes is that in the ancient world, the rules of behavior structuring pleasure and the body were more limited and a lot looser. There was a wide range of sexual activities possible. Heterosexual marriage, yes. Homosexuality, everywhere. Drinking parties where men have young boys for pleasure. There is sexuality in marriage and out of marriage. There is, as Foucault points out, a widespread belief in classical Rome and Athens and other Greek city-states that pleasure can get out of hand. One can become obsessed with bodily pleasure, and so the norm is moderation. But in general, his view is that the ancient Greek and Roman ways of sexuality, of regard for sexuality, are less bureaucratized. They are not subject to governmentality. They are, so to say, freer, with a sense of the importance of moderation. And what's really important, says Foucault, is this care for the self. That is to say, Greeks and Romans thought that pleasure of the body was a very important part of life. And so important was it that each person for themselves had to cultivate their bodies, the beauty of their bodies, and the pleasure that they gained from others. This is a very important point in Foucault because it raises the question of whether this care for the self remains relevant in the years of the 20th century in which he wrote. What he wants to say, the short answer is yes, and what he wants to say is that his work on the history of sexuality prepares the ground, intellectually speaking, for a new understanding of politics. The politics of the body, the politics of the personal. He didn't write about the food we eat. He didn't write about the clothing in which we dress. He didn't write about the damage that we personally have on our environments, and so on. But what he wanted to say is that each individual with sufficient awareness can become capable of reversing power relations that are exercised over their bodies by doctors, by psychiatrists, by men, by straight people. Each individual acting with others can begin a reversal of power in which that politics is about caring for themselves. It's not narcissistic. It's caring for themselves in the sense that these are survival strategies that enable people to live better lives, happier lives, more pleasurable lives. And this, of course, was Foucault's way of announcing that there should be no norms when it comes to sexuality. That is, there should be no single norm of defining what is the right or proper form of sexuality. He was a pluralist. He was, of course, gay and suffered for his homosexuality at many points in his life. What he wants to say is that whether you are straight or gay, or whether you are lesbian, or whether you are transgender, or whatever, so long as there is no violation of the body of another, rape is not cool. Violence against another, not cool. But so long as there is respect for the other, politics, redefined, is now the art of reversing dominant power relations and finding yourself in life and in the wider world, caring for yourself. One last implication, and it should, I think, be clear. Foucault was often asked whether he was a revolutionary. I mean, he had anarchist tendencies, that's, you can probably tell. But he didn't like describing himself as a leftist or rightist. He was often asked whether he's a revolutionary. And this was one of his answers. This is the answer in the history of sexuality. Yes, there are these moments when millions of people caring for themselves gather together. There's an uprising and they overthrow an order. His criticism of revolutionaries is that revolutionaries traditionally, from the end of the 18th century, suppose that power is sovereign power. You know, what do you do in a revolution? If you're a Bolshevik, you seize the post office and the telecommunications office. You get hold of the army and the police, and then you begin restructuring the whole social order. You know, you grab power at the top. Foucault says this is a mistaken understanding of power, and in the case of revolution, it has typically ended badly. It produces many casualties, and it can reinforce all kinds of nasty power relations. So here's his point. Here on, he's reflecting on May '68 and the aftermath of the French student worker upheaval. Here on, what we are more likely to see, and I think this remark is prophetic, it came to describe what is now typical in Western-type democracies and societies. What we're likely to see is an ongoing politics of pushing and being pushed back, of fracturing of unities, of regroupings. A politics that's mobile, a politics that's transitory. You know, we have #MeToo at the moment. It didn't exist a year ago. It probably will go away. But what it is doing, it's raising all sorts of questions about male behavior in Hollywood and in politics and in business and universities and other institutions. And Foucault says this is typical. It's not a demand for revolution. There's no political party that leads it. It's a network of individuals clustered together in a kind of alliance, in a networked way, questioning the biopower relations in which those people live and in which institutions function. And asking, demanding that the maltreatment of women, the treatment of women as sexual objects, that those kinds of power relations are not legitimate and can be reversed, they can be changed. That, friends and colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, is a rough guide, an introduction to why Michel Foucault thinks that a third understanding of politics is necessary. An understanding of politics is about the body, as about those power relations that are very close to us. And politics is about the possibility of reversing power relations and caring for oneself in relation to others. 谢谢你. Thank you very much.